president.
So without further ado, Mike Chrisemer.
Hello, everyone. This summer I went on a trip to Cuba, and as the description of this event is, I'm here to share with my experience about that, but I also kind of want to contextualize what the trip is about. And Cuba in general, I think, is really important, and it's really kind of divisive topic, especially in Florida. So I think that, you know, regardless of what conceptions you have about Cuba, maybe coming to this kind of an open mind, or at least, you know, hold those kind of comments and questions till the end. I hope we have a lot of discussion towards the end, and we can get to those kinds of things. So, because, you know, Cuba and Miami is there's a lot of very emotional kind of, you know, emotionally loaded opinions on Cuba, and I think that's really important to kind of dispel those things and get through like what's really going on, and what, you know, us as activists, a lot of people in this room are activists, like how we should relate to Cuba and why that's important for activists in Florida, I think, and that's, hopefully I'll make an argument that's very important for everyone here to be aware of these issues, especially in Tallahassee, which is the capital. So the Venceremos Brigade is the group that I went to Cuba with, and they were founded in 1969 by Students for a Democratic Society, which is an old organization back then of, it was a big anti-war, you know, leftist activist group. And they also actually founded CPE as well. So CPE and the Venceremos Brigade have the exact same, like, almost, you know, probably the same year. They were both founded by the same group. So I think that's pretty important. And as far as I understand, the Venceremos Brigade had a lot of people in Tallahassee going to the trip. I don't know if Bob Burdell was talking about how a lot of people, and I don't know if you know about how, you know, apparently Tallahassee was a big, you know, hotspot for people going to Cuba, which is not the case anymore, and hopefully that can change. So the brigade has been going to Cuba for 40 years, ever since 1969, and the purpose is mainly to challenge the travel ban. So right now, as American citizens, unless you have family in Cuba, you're not allowed to go to Cuba, and the Venceremos Brigade believes, first and foremost, that that needs to be challenged. That's one of the three main purposes of the brigade. Right now, it's challenging the travel ban from American citizens going to Cuba, ending the blockade against Cuba, the economic embargo, and then the third main thing is there's what's called the Cuban Five, which you have information about right now, hopefully, which are 5 Cuban political prisoners in the United States, and I'll get to that later, why that's important, and why it's such a big deal in Cuba and in America, and especially for Florida. So to start, we should really get, you know, kind of a contextualization of the Cuban Revolution and how that's important for the United States in general. Because in 1959, once the Cuban Revolution triumphed, it, you know, kind of made people in the United States very uncomfortable, and particularly those people who were in power. And as they saw it as, you know, the relationship between the United States and Cuba was very unbalanced in favor of the United States' power interests at the time, and the Cuban Revolution really challenged that. So once the Cuban Revolution developed more of a socialist character, the United States instantly almost put an embargo, I believe in 1961, on Cuba, which really has harmed Cuba ever since. And up until that point, Cuba had, well, at that point, Cuba started moving towards the socialist camp. The Soviet Union was the #1 trading partner from the early 60s up until 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. So Cuba was able at that time to kind of you know, deal with the embargo. It wasn't, you know, devastating as it is now. But after 1991, once the Soviet Union fell, Cuba entered what was called the special period, or what they call the special period. And that was a time of economic stagnation and lots of problems for Cuba that still exist today, but have been alleviated, I think, through, you know, various sources. And I think it's that context that, you know, when you go to Cuba, and when I went to Cuba, people need to understand that, like, there is, not only is Cuba a developing country, but it's a country that's been under the victim of economic warfare for a very long time. And that's, you know, the Venceremos Brigade, while we go to Cuba, is to kind of bring that perspective to people who aren't familiar with that. We get in our media a, you know, very simplistic picture. Cuba has an evil dictator, and they have all these problems that are a result of their government type, and the brigade is kind of there to challenge those directly. It's like, well, let's go. Since we're not allowed to actually go see it, we need to be able to do that. And through that process, we're able to directly see what's going on there. So the trip, and I handed out an article that I wrote for Liberation News, which is shameless self-promotion, but also, I kind of go over the trip and what the purpose of the trip is. And it's not just to, it's not like a tourist trip. You don't go to Cuba with the Venceremos Brigade with, to see nice sights and do all these things. Although you do that, you do see like, beautiful, Cuba's a beautiful country. We got, at one point we were going through like caves and mountains and all that kind of stuff. You get to do that kind of stuff, but for the most part it's really, it's an activist trip. You're going as a political expression. You're opposing the travel ban, you're building solidarity with the people of Cuba, and you're raising awareness in the United States. And that's a really important distinction from a trip to anywhere else.
Are there any other countries that have travel bans to Cuba besides the United States?
No, actually, that's an interesting point, Patrick. There are no other countries that disallow their own citizens from going anywhere else, anywhere, as far as I understand. It's is a unique situation that the United States and Cuba has. Actually, I don't know of anywhere else that the United States disallows its citizens from going other than to Cuba. And technically, the original travel challenge or travel ban was in the early 60s after the revolution. Cuba you were not allowed with your passport to go to Cuba. That was challenged in court. So technically, you're allowed to go to Cuba. You just cannot spend any money when you were there without a license from the United States government. So the Venceremos Brigade, there's a lot of groups that go to Cuba. You can apply for a license through the U.S. government and get permission from the United States government to go to Cuba. The brigade, there's two groups. There's Venceremos Brigade and Pastors for Peace, who both, kind of ignore that, saying that we don't feel like we should have to apply for a permit to go to a place. That doesn't make any sense. Why is it that to go to Cuba or even, like North Korea or wherever else, we can just go there, yet for Cuba we have to ask for permission from our government? That doesn't make any sense. It's unconstitutional. And we very explicitly, very openly, by going there, we call it a travel challenge. So we announced publicly through a press conference that we're ignoring this travel challenge, and go ahead, challenge us in court, essentially, because we feel like it's a very winnable case, and it's a very important thing too in general. So, the brigade has started doing that more openly only in the past 10 years. Before that, it wasn't as open, but it was, it's become a very important thing, challenging that. And there was one point that a Senate committee or some congressional committee listed the brigade as the biggest public relations issue for the travel ban today. This was only within the past 10 years. So the brigade is clearly making an impact on the public's perception of what U.S.-Cuba relations are and how that needs to be changed by openly admitting, we're not concerned with this, we think it's wrong. It brings up the issue. And a lot of people, if you ask, the average person, even the average Cuban American about the embargo especially, why do we still have it? Most people think that it doesn't make any sense and we need to end it. And that's something that we try to actively make happen by challenging the travel ban. So it's not just raising awareness, we're directly challenging it. And when we're there, we do all kinds of different activities that aren't, while, like I said earlier, there's the sightseeing, we do work that's mostly symbolic. We work in different fields, we work alongside Cubans, we do presentation, we go to presentations. So, for example, and I wrote this in my article, we have a program when we're there, and a lot of it is very, it can come off as like, oh, here's the Cuban officials telling us how things are, and that's that. And there are a lot of presentations of, the economic conditions in Cuba, why they're that way. There's presentations on the judicial system in Cuba, elections, how they work, all these things that can come off kind of like a justification for what's going on to people who aren't very familiar with the Cuban system. But at each of these presentations that I experienced, the Cubans, especially when they were officials, challenged us to directly talk with the Cuban people because we have free time when they're like, if you don't believe us, go find out for yourself. They didn't have secret police following us the whole time or anything. It was, they directly challenged us. You'll find people who disagree with our revolution here and go see for yourself, essentially. And that's essentially what the idea of the trip is seeing for yourself what the Cuban Revolution has been able to do. So the brigade, and it's also not, there's a misconception that like, oh, clearly it's a bunch of commies going on this, obviously it's just people who are like trying to justify all these things. But I would say that the majority of the people on the trip that I went on were not socialist even. A lot of people were, there were a few people who weren't even like that politicized. So I think that's a really important distinction. Like it doesn't take a radical or, communist perspective to oppose these things in Cuba, because there's a lot of people who are liberals, even conservatives, who think that the travel ban and embargo don't make any sense whatsoever, and that we need to challenge those things and end them. So, and that's what the Brigade is really open to people from all kinds of different perspectives. It's not just, a leftist thing, although leftists had started. So I think that, and while we're there, there's different themes, like I said. There's the embargo and the travel, less so the travel challenge, but the embargo is like a very important theme when you're in Cuba. I mean, you can see the effects of it pretty much everywhere you go. The United States and Cuba they were the strongest trading partners of each other for a long time. The United States would buy Cuba's sugar, and it was a very important economic relationship until the revolution changed all that. And those effects are very prevalent today. So you see a lot of that talk in Cuba about the travel, or about the embargo, and it's very, very important in the consciousness of people there. And that's something that a lot of the things that we do there are built to, help Americans understand what their government is doing to the people of Cuba. I mean, it's not like we're just, deciding not to buy their crops. We actively make sure that they have a difficult time economically, and that has real consequences to real people. And part of the purpose of the Brigade is to show you as Americans what your country is doing to these people and experience that. You get to, feel what it's like to, be in Cuba, and you get to, walk the streets and do work and live in places like the Cubans do. And it's not, you don't get special treatment. It's not a vacation, like I said earlier. You get to actually experience it. And I think that's a really important thing for Americans to understand, that regardless of your opinions of the Cuban government and the Cuban Revolution, it's important to see what effects your country is having on these people who decided to, take a different route from the U.S. accepted, way of being a developing country, essentially. So I think that, while, and on top of that, there's another aspect that's really important, especially for Floridian activists, to U.S.-Cuba relations, is the Cuban Five. And the Cuban Five were 5 Cuban agents who came to, I believe it was Florida, on an intelligence gathering mission to, so Cuba has long been the victim of terrorist attacks from groups based in Florida, actually. And those groups have, like for example, there's the famous picture of Che that everyone knows, the most reproduced image in all of photographic history, was at a memorial for a terrorist attack that had just happened in Cuba. And this is, there's been multiple attacks, and a lot of these groups are based right here in Florida. So these Cuban agents were sent to the United States to investigate, because Cuba had formally requested the United States do something about it. The United States as this anti-terrorist, country, very, opposed to terrorism, fighting, with the war on terrorism and everything, was ignoring groups based in its own country that were attacking another country. And through that, these agents were trying to gather intelligence on these groups the United States was ignoring. And as a result of that, those 5 agents were arrested, and a lot of them, most of them are still in jail. One actually recently got out, but he's on parole in Florida, actually. And, in Cuba, that's the reason that's become such an important topic there, is because Cuba has been the victim of terrorism for a long time, and these people were came here to fight against that, and completely, the United States, actually, the Cuban officials that were here had planned a meeting with U.S. officials to help find these organizations, and as a result were arrested. It's pretty, there's tons of documentaries on this. It's a very important topic. And so a lot of people who do Cuba solidarity work consider them to be political prisoners, and that's a very important topic for solidarity work in Florida, which is where some of the Cuban Five are. And I think it's really important to have contact with them and raise awareness of what our country's relationship with not only Cuba as a country, but how it is that we have allowed certain groups to interact with Cuba in a very violent way. And I think that has raised the consciousness in Cuba to a certain extent, And it should raise the consciousness of activists here who that topic is sometimes kind of overlooked, and it's really unfortunate, especially in a place like Florida where this is the origin of a lot of these things. So, you know, in that sense, the Cuban Five, you hear about it quite a lot in Cuba and in the United States, in activist circles who do Cuban solidarity work. But it's, you know, in Cuba, you see pictures of them everywhere. It's very important, and I think that that's the main message I got from a lot of the people I was there with. You know, what is it the United States citizens can do to help Cuba? And that was pretty much the answer. Almost unanimously was always, you know, help get the Cuban Five out of prison. So that's why, I mean, it's one little thing, but it's very important, I think, in my opinion. So, I mean, and that, you know, while that was a recurring theme in Cuba, we also did a lot of things. You know, we would visit, on top of the presentations and things we did, we went to, you know, factories, we went to hospitals, we went to all kinds of different tours of places, and, you know, it was essentially kind of, and it's a 2-week trip, so you know, get what you can of a whole country in 2 weeks. Obviously, you can never really experience even a city in 2 weeks, but, you know, we were able to really get, you know, a feel for what it's like to live there. And no one, regardless of what, you know, preconceptions you have going in, you're going to, you know, at least experience directly you know, you're going to understand it more, I think. So even me as, obviously, a leftist who supports the Cuban Revolution, it was interesting to just see how people, like, lived almost like, you know, normal lives when you have this conception that it's not normal to be in a place that's, you know, run by a communist party. And even, you know, like, it can come off as very, you know, official state-guided for a lot of these things that happen, but one day in Havana, for example, we had a free day, and a group of us were just walking around, and we walked by a school, and one of the teachers just, like, you know, we popped our heads in, and she was like, oh, come, you know, take a look at the school, and gave us a whole tour of the entire school that was once a Cuban railroad official, like the railroad industry owner's house that's been converted into a school, just out of nowhere, impromptu, just gave us a little tour of the whole place that was very similar to all the other tours we had gotten officially. So, I mean, experiences like that happen a lot. You really get a taste for what it's like to be in Cuba, what it's like, you know, to live under socialism, I think. And regardless of whether Cuba will remain socialist or whether Cuba will become capitalist and implement reforms, the message of the Venceremos Brigade is that it's up to Cubans to decide that. It's not up to Americans to decide what Cuba will do. So acts like the Cuban Democracy Act of the early 90s or the Helms-Burton Act, which very explicitly tried to sabotage the Cuban economy and government, we reject that, as we don't feel that it's the place of the United States to direct what will happen in Cuba. It's up to Cubans. So if they want to restore capitalism, that's up to them. It's not up to the United States. So in that sense, that's the primary goal of it, is to raise consciousness and to really get a feel for it. So I guess we should open for questions soon. I don't know. That's time for that. I'm sure that's a lot of information in one thing, but I mean, I think for a topic like this, it's really good to have a conversation, especially in Florida. So, Cecilia.
Did you get any free health care when you were in Cuba?
Yes, actually I did. Yes, I got sick one day, and they had, you know, they just saw me, no bill or anything after. They asked me what was wrong, saw me. It was a nurse practitioner on site in the hotel that we were staying at. And that was a very different experience as an American who's used to not having free healthcare. That was a pleasant, different kind of experience, especially in a country like Cuba that is not very wealthy, you know, where nonetheless they have decided to devote their social resources to something like that. So even me, as somebody visiting, was able to just, you know, get checked up on, and all right, you'll be fine. You know, it's very interesting. It's a different kind of feel for, you know, in America if that happens, you get, you know, and here's your bill after, and that's not the case there.
Did you happen to bump into anyone who overtly did not support the Cuban Revolution or the Communist Party?
Well, so for me, there was a serious language barrier, since I don't speak Spanish that well. You know, most of the people on the trip did speak Spanish, and I was able to, you know, through translation, talk to a lot of people. But that's a serious barrier for someone like me, who's, you know, I'm able to talk to people, but like on free time, it's not like it's a different kind of conversation when you have to have everything translated. So like I would try, like for example, we went to a Cuban factory a cigar factory. And after I, went to the person who was like our guide and asked, questions about like worker ownership, the relations between the workers and the factory and all these things. And like I had, a ton of questions, but through translation it gets kind of, bogged down and everything. So in my experience, no. I mean, people did seem very supportive. But then again, I don't know if that's really a fair, cross-section of opinion because of the language barrier for me. But I mean, for people who aren't, there's plenty of free time in Havana or any of the other cities you get to go to. You can just walk around but I mean, it's also weird, when you're in a city you've never been to, just be like, hey, so what do you think of the government? Like, I mean, but and even if finding support, like, they might be like, who are you? Like, but I mean, there's, spray painted in random neighborhoods, Viva Fidel, that's, I don't know, there were things like that. I mean, and people seemed like, there were different organizations that were very, I mean, there are a lot of organizations in Cuba, and they seemed very, like, for example, one of the things we did was like we visited the federation, the Women's Federation in Cuba, and originally we were going to meet at their office and get an official presentation, all that, and they had decided that didn't make any sense. We should meet at one of their houses and have a neighborhood party. And like through that, we were like, they were just like, come on over, and like, like we were talking to everyone. It seemed like a very, like if an organization like that if I had that experience here, I would feel that was a very like grassroots, like organization of people devoted to, social justice.